This is the Bonfire Gamescast, episode 376. I'm your host, Morgan, aka Bon Diesel, and this week we'll be talking about PlayStation shuttering another studio, Todd Howard talking Starfield, and much more, Battlefield 6 Season 2 thoughts, and much more. First, be sure to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app, leave a review on Spotify or iTunes, and subscribe to the Bon Diesel YouTube channel to get all of my videos, including this podcast. Thank you to everyone who supports as YouTube members and or Twitch subscribers. If you are interested in supporting this podcast and all of my other content, please check out the links in the show description for my other content, merch, and more. Let's get into the gaming news. We're going to kick it off with PlayStation has shuttered Bluepoint Studio. This was pretty surprising. One of the podcasts I saw react to this was Kind of Funny, and they have a thing called Kind of Feudy, and it's a game show essentially where they ask their community questions and then they guess to see what the most popular answers were, and if you guess the most popular, you get the most points, and so on. It's like Family Feud. And while they were discussing and kind of honestly blowing off some steam about this studio being shut down, they brought up a question they had asked their community a while back, but didn't use it in the show because honestly it felt kind of mean-spirited. And they asked their community of, I believe they had around 3,000 responses, what PlayStation Studio is most likely to get shut down. And oddly enough, it became rather topical that I believe Bluepoint was the 7th most voted on. Now, I think it's worth acknowledging that Kind of Funny is I think it's reasonable to say they're a PlayStation-oriented community. And so I suspect most of these votes weren't done like in anger or aggressively. They were just people being like, here's the studios we think are probably in the worst spot. Now, the top rated ones were studios like Bend, I think was the number one. Most likely they made Days Gone and they haven't done anything since. As well as Haven, I think was number 2. They're making the Fair Games extraction looter game that basically everyone just recognizes now. Like this game, like it's just gonna suffer the same fate as all of these other games in that same situation. But Bluepoint was 7th, and in fact, Bluepoint was 7th, and number 6 was Naughty Dog. Now, you have to imagine at least a decent number of those Naughty Dog votes were people just being, the kind of carryover of all the weird stuff with The Last of Us 2 and people not liking Neil for various reasons. Because they're not going to shut down Naughty Dog, right? But Bluepoint being that far down made probably people think that, hey, there's no way this studio is going. And it is. Now, what was kind of surprising to me is that when they, what's kind of come out after this announcement is that it's going to affect about 70 jobs. This is happening in March. That's a pretty tiny studio, all things considered. It's also worth remembering they haven't released a game since 2020, and I believe that was before they even got acquired. They released a Demon's Souls remake, and that was one of the big notable exclusives, PlayStation 5 exclusives, when it launched as a console. And and it's kind of funny to think back that, that first year or so, PlayStation 5 had a bunch of exclusives. Now, they probably could have been cross-gen games, but they made the smart decision to move hardware by, making God of War Ragnarok and Demon's Souls and these other games next-gen only, to get people to get into the next gen, right? That's their strategy. It works for them. But it's also kind of notable that their production of first-party exclusives has dropped off a lot after that first year and a half with, Ragnarok, Demon's Souls, Ratchet and Clank, and so on. And that kind of is reflected with Bluepoint. They got acquired and they've never released a game. We are under the impression that for a big chunk of the last 6 years, they've been working inexplicably on a God of War live service game, because that's a word that exists. And that recently got shut down, and they've spent about the last year trying to pitch new projects. Now, I've had, and I've seen this chatter, and I've had someone direct message me who's just kind of like me, kind of just throwing out guesses and speculation, but throwing out that there was probably some agreement with Bluepoint to get acquired, that they were going to be allowed to make new content. The 3 games they did release while they still existed were all PlayStation remakes of some capacity. And even though they are super good at it, and obviously that was something they were very talented at, that's not, what they always want to do. You see this pretty often with support studios and remaster studios, where they're cool with doing that long enough to like pay the bills, but they're not going to do it forever. And that's, I think that's fair. I don't, you kind of can't blame them, right? They don't just want to rehash stuff forever. But that also comes at the expense of, if you don't put anything out, and whether it's your fault or not, you're not probably long for this world. A really good analogy to this is Ubisoft and their studio Red Storm. Before Red Storm was acquired by Ubisoft, they were the Tom Clancy studio. Red Storm, like, literally was created to make Tom Clancy games. And, they made the original Rainbow Sixes and things like that. And I think the last game that they headed up themselves that was like big AAA game was Ghost Recon Future Warrior, which to this day I still think is the last real Ghost Recon game. Wildlands and Breakpoint and whatever they do next are made by a different studio and just clearly have a different direction, a different idea of what Ghost Recon is. And they, then became a co-dev studio with The Division. And then with Division 2, they were a co-dev studio again, and they had this initial idea to make essentially a DLC for Division 2. It was going to be a sequel to the survival mode in the first game. And then they kind of got big in their britches a little bit and said, hey, actually, we want to take this survival mode idea and turn it into its own game. That turned into, a Heartland, the Division Heartland, which spent like 4 years in development and then got shuttered. I know this explicitly because from almost day one, I was kind of like a consultant, as like a player consultant on the game, and got to play basically every iteration of it that I'm aware of, all the way from being almost a battle royale to being like an extraction game to being a PvE like story-based game before it got shuttered. And now Red Storm has suffered a ton of layoffs. And they, probably aren't long for this world, unfortunately, even though they're this like storied studio. And, we're looking at a similar situation here with Bluepoint. They, they were good at something and they probably didn't want to keep doing that thing. And that may have been to their detriment in the long run. Now, I think the real story here is to talk about what's going on with PlayStation. It's so easy with Microsoft, and we'll talk about Microsoft in this conversation as well. To look at Microsoft acquiring all these studios, shutting some of them down, and not and selling half the consoles of the PlayStation 5, and all the conversation has been about Xbox. And when it is about PlayStation, it's typically about like, hey, look, they've sold 90 million PlayStation 5s, which is a legitimately impressive number. That's insane, especially after they sold so many PS4s in the previous generation. But what I think hasn't been talked about a whole lot is the last like 3 or 4 years, they've put out like very, very, very few first party games. They don't have a ton of studios. I want to say they're around 15 or 20 studios. Obviously, like Xbox is putting out a half dozen first party games a year. They also have like 50 studios under their belt at this point. I don't think it's that many, but it's a lot, right? But that kind of doesn't excuse the PlayStation side. Like, we have multiple PlayStation studios, these big name studios who have made these like single player experiences that really have like defined PlayStation, at least this generation and last, or well, really more just PlayStation 4, but also PlayStation 3, who haven't like made a game yet, or at least not like a new game, like Naughty Dog. They haven't made a PlayStation 5 game. They've remastered The Last of Us 1 and 2 multiple times at this point, and remade it, quote unquote. It wasn't, it's a whole different discussion, but they haven't done much. And then you have, like Sony Santa Monica, they did have Ragnarok, even though I would argue pretty heavily that probably could have been a cross-gen game. Making it a next-gen game was kind of just a sales tactic, which again makes complete sense. But, I think it was very early in this generation and nothing since. We're getting teases that they may reveal something later this year, but you're still talking like that probably means they're not releasing anything until 27, 28. And if all the craziness happening right now wasn't happening, that would probably mean that they could have gone almost the whole generation releasing one game, kind of, right? Now, with things that we'll talk about here in a moment, or later in this episode, that may not be, exactly what happens. We may be looking at a long PlayStation 5 lifespan. So maybe, all these studios will get games out before then. We know like Naughty Dog has Intergalactic, Santa Monica has whatever they're working on now, I would assume will be done in the next year or two. But it is strange and it doesn't get talked about a lot. And, there's a handful of studios that haven't done a whole lot this generation, or at least not lately. You've got Bend, you've got Media Molecule, even studios that are working on things that people aren't super excited about. And it kind of goes back to the whole thing, from a while back when was it Jim Ryan made that announcement. I want to say it was in like 22 or 23, saying like, well, we want to have 12 live service games out by 2025. And it's 2026 and they've released one that still exists. And it was made by a third-party studio, even though it is their own first-party IP with Helldivers 2. So, like, it's so crazy. I think they've had this huge, like, monumental initiative this generation for PlayStation, where they got away from letting their studios make that Horizon game, The Last of Us 3, from, a new God of War game. And they've made them kind of do other stuff. And they've abandoned most of those projects at this point, whether it was multiplayer or live service or both. And now we're in this weird situation where, their premier studios, or even their less premier studios, spent years and millions of dollars making games that either came out and shut down a week later, or just never came out at all. And they wasted a whole bunch of time on that when they really shouldn't have. Horizon is a good example. I'm sure there's a lot of people. Horizon is kind of a weird game where it's kind of like not taken super seriously in conversation, but it's sold insanely well in both, last gen and this gen, and the first game and second game. They probably by now should be pumping out a third game. But then we find out recently they're doing this live service game that's going to be a multiplayer experience on PC and PlayStation. And then we find out later, like, this isn't just some small team at Guerrilla who's making that, while everyone else is working on a Horizon 3 or a new Killzone game or something, who knows. It's a majority of the studio working on this live service game, and that's how it's going to have to be. That's why they shied away from doing live service with Naughty Dog and some of these other studios, because you don't just make a live service game, release it, and move on like you do your single player games, or maybe make a DLC or whatever. You have to release it and then keep working on it. And if it's multiplayer, you're going to have to balance it and figure out cheats and exploits and bugs. And you're going to have to release new content, and you're going to have a battle pass and a seasonal system. And, and that takes up your whole studio. As a Division fan, I've watched Ubisoft Massive struggle with this ever since they released Division 1, where you kind of got this feeling like, obviously they knew they had to make more content, but they didn't realize that people we're going to burn through the content they released that they worked on for 4 or 5 years. And they were going to burn through it in a week, a few days sometimes. And, and they really struggled with that in the first game. And in the second game, they've released more content than you can imagine. The quality of it may be in discussion, but that's a different video, right? And so with Guerrilla, they're in that situation where, once that game comes out, they can pare down the team to be a more focused live service team that won't be the whole studio, but it's going to be a lot of it, and it's going to take up a ton of resources. And so, we'll have to see how that plays out. We have Bungie dealing with the same thing that, with Destiny 1 and 2 most recently. Well, now they're not only going to be doing live service with Destiny 2 as they continue releasing new content with that, they're going to be trying to revive an old IP that no one remembers in Marathon with an extraction hero shooter that they're going to have to be doing live service too. So, their team's going to be split. I assume they have two very distinct teams with this. They aren't, probably sharing that many people, but still, it's still a big resource suck, especially when Marathon, as much as it's getting pumped up with right now, which we'll talk about in another story, it's got to be successful. And it's hard to get new IPs to be successful, even though it's technically an old IP, especially a multiplayer looter shooter service game that, that market is so saturated right now. Even though it is from PlayStation, even though it is multi-platform, it's more complicated than that. So, I saw a post about how since 2019, so right before the PlayStation 5 generation, they've acquired 10 studios. PlayStation has 3 of them are straight up closed at this point. Most of them haven't released a game this generation. All of them have had layoffs at some point, and Bungie being one of them doesn't seem the healthiest. It seems almost certain that unless maybe Marathon's a huge hit, Bungie, who is currently actually under Sony, not PlayStation, it's a weird deal, is probably at the very least going to get put under PlayStation no matter what, and very likely may become a not Destiny studio. Maybe they have to work on other stuff. Maybe they start supporting other studios, which we think they probably already have. Like, we heard those stories about the Last of Us multiplayer game that Naughty Dog was working on, that the Destiny devs were kind of, helping them out with that or consulting on it. So I'm sure there's crosstalk happening anyways, but there's a world where Bungie isn't really a thing in 5 years, right? Now maybe they announced Destiny 3 and they put a live service team on Marathon and they kind of shutter Destiny 2 work, and maybe they do the thing they probably should have started doing like 5 years ago and start working on Destiny 3 if they aren't already. But that's not guaranteed at this point. I think it would have been at one point. But whether or not this Marathon thing was pushed on them or something they wanted to do, these things are complicated, right? And so, this comes along, and I think the news that got kind of covered up by this studio closure, which makes sense, was that new rumors are popping up from reliable sources that PlayStation's probably gonna have to raise the prices of their consoles. And then that comes in the back end of these conversations about the PlayStation 6, which was maybe planned for like 2027, likely being pushed back to 28, 29, even as far back as 30. I've seen some pretty reliable people speculating on. That's a big deal, and maybe that's going to be a good thing in the long run, where they let the PlayStation 5 breathe, and maybe all these studios they have do finally get out a second game or a first game this generation. Like, that's probably a good thing in the long run, but it's a weird look right now, and it's it's because of multiple things, and like their issue with closing these studios and stuff. This has nothing to do with tariffs or the RAM prices and stuff. But it's going to like stack, right? Like, it's going to domino effect where, they're having these issues with getting games out because their games are taking too long, and they kind of spun their wheels in the mud with all these live service initiatives. And it's going to take them 5 years or more to recover from that if they want to get back on doing their single player thing. But here's the problem. Their single player games that sell pretty well, like, aren't paying for themselves. There's, been a lot of discussion about games like Spider-Man 2, which was like, I think its Metacritic score, its scores were in like the 80s. Like, it's pretty good, but it probably, the rumor was that it cost them like $300 million to make. And if that includes marketing, that's still a lot of money. If it doesn't include marketing, you're looking at $400-500 million. And even though it sold pretty well, it didn't sell enough to recoup that or to be very profitable. So then that's why you see things like that happens. Even though they have this wildly successful game sell well, it still doesn't make hardly any money. So then you see PlayStation chase the Fortnite train of, okay, we're going to try and make like 12 different live service games. If one of them hits, we're good. And now we're in a situation where maybe none of them are going to hit. And the one that has hit, Helldivers 2, that's a licensed situation with a third-party studio. So it's still probably very profitable for PlayStation, that game is, because it has microtransactions and all that. But they are sharing some of that profit, which, if it was an internal studio, that wouldn't be the case. At least the numbers would be looked at differently. And so they're in this weird situation where they're, their prestige games that they make really aren't sustainable for them. They're trying this live service thing because that is sustainable, but it's not working so far. And luckily, and to be very clear, PlayStation's making an insane amount of money. They're just raking in the cash because, just like with every platform, or at least with Xbox and PlayStation, they make the most money off of third-party games anyways. They obviously, their first parties help because it's a higher profit margin and all that, but they still make most of their money off of Call of Duty, FIFA, Madden, all that. That's what the majority of their people buy, like 2 games a year, and it's those games. Or now the Call of Duty thing gets more complicated, but that's a different video, right? And so then we run into the situation where when this came up, the first thing I saw a lot of people doing, like doing the console war thing of like, well, Xbox is laying off a bunch of studios too. There's been people saying like, oh, Xbox should take in Bluepoint and do this. And what was annoying about that is that, obviously Xbox has had their own issues with layoffs and things like that and shutting down studios. It has been different though. And I think it's a bad faith comparison because Bluepoint is a studio that it seems like this was just mismanagement. When you look at the games and the studios that have been canceled or shuttered by Xbox in the last 3-4 years, you're looking at like Tango Gameworks, which was a studio that was a complicated one because Hi-Fi Rush was so enjoyed and so well reviewed, but it didn't sell. It didn't sell, and it didn't really help Game Pass on Xbox. And then even when they put it over on PlayStation, I think Switch as well, it literally sold nothing over there. And that was in that same round where they put, Grounded and Sea of Thieves over there as well, which sold like gangbusters, which did really well on PlayStation. And Hi-Fi Rush didn't, because it is that single player kind of thing where the other games are multiplayer games, and those are just right now, those are just more popular and more profitable, unfortunately. And so you had a studio like Tango Gameworks, which I remember I looked up a bunch of this stuff back in the day, but they basically hadn't had a big hit game since The Evil Within, like 15-20 years earlier. They had released other games, and some of them had done okay. Other Evil Within games, Tokyo, what was that called? Tokyo something. It was like the Ghost game, but it didn't sell at all. Like, it did really bad actually. And then Hi-Fi Rush comes out and reviews very well, but doesn't sell. It doesn't make any money. It flounders. And that was a studio that, even if you dig back in the acquisition stuff, when my Xbox was acquiring ZeniMax and Bethesda, it looked like Tango Gameworks was probably going to get shuttered back then, and then they got acquired by Xbox, and Xbox kind of like let them do their thing. The same thing happened with Arcane Austin. That was another studio that hadn't done anything. They co-devved on a game years before that did okay, that did pretty well, but it wasn't their game. And then everything they had done since hadn't done well, and that culminated with Redfall, which I still say is the last bad game Xbox put out. Everything they've done since has at least been good, if not really good. And Redfall was a disaster. It was a bad game. And that was Xbox literally, taking a studio that was going to get shuttered before it got acquired, and then letting them do a thing that they didn't even really approve of, but they didn't want to be overly pushy with their new studios. And then they let them make this game, and it sucked. It was bad. And it was just bad. Like, it just was like, and I'm a fanboy of Xbox. Like, if anything, I should be like, oh, actually Redfall was okay, and they made it better before they, no, they didn't. It was a bad game. It was one of the least interesting experiences I've ever had in my life. And that studio got shut down because of it. So when you compare Bluepoint, which kind of seems like it was just mismanaged, whether that was internal or external, or probably both, it's not the same comparison, because the 3 games that Bluepoint has released have all been excellent and done really well. Where you talk about Arcane Austin, you talk about a Tango Gameworks. These aren't studios that did well. They weren't putting out high quality games that they needed to, or to the point that they had to be sustainable. The Initiative is another one I've seen people bring up. Like, that was like a couple dozen people heading a project that was being mostly worked on by a third party dev, and it just wasn't going anywhere. Like, it obviously wasn't going to happen, and it's a failure, and that's on Xbox for probably mismanagement and things like that as well. But I would argue it's a different thing. It's a different situation, especially because, you know, if you listen to all the conversations that have been happening for the last 5 years, and especially the last couple of years, with Xbox making this big multi-platform change of de-emphasizing their own hardware and all that stuff. And then you have the other side of the story being PlayStation selling 90 million plus PlayStation 5s, and you having all these prestige, you know, games that are mostly third-party games they're just getting timed exclusives for. You would think, like, you know, like, how is PlayStation having to shut down studios? They're selling so many consoles. They're making so much money. And it's because they are selling lots of consoles that are low profit margin, if at all, if not losing money, especially right now. And they're selling, and they are making a lot of money, but they're spending a ton of money on the games that they're making, and many of them those games are getting canceled, and the studios that they're paying that money to or using that money on are getting shuttered, right? Like, that's not like, you're making lots of money, lots of revenue, but not a lot of profit. And, you know, I just criticize Xbox. Go nuts. I don't know if this new strategy is going to work for them, you know, de-emphasizing console and, you know, doing this multi-platform thing. That may crash and burn. I have no idea. But, like, you can't tell me, you know, with like Xbox having Ninja Theory, Undead Labs, Double Fine, like, you don't, like, those studios wouldn't still be around on PlayStation. And who knows, maybe they'll get shuttered at Xbox too. I don't know. But those studios are all providing things to the Xbox, you know, game, you know, studios brand, right? Where Ninja Theory is like, has these like amazing facilities for motion capture, and the games they put out are good, even if they don't sell super well. Double Fine is just like a legendary studio led by a legendary dude who's just, you know, has a good rep in the industry, and that's probably half of why they're still around. Undead Labs, I kind of don't know why they're still around, if you want me to be totally honest. I love State of Decay, and I am really excited for the third game. But them still existing and still making that game is kind of a testament that, like, if Xbox was just trying to cut every studio that was costing them money without revenue, you know, there's studios they would be shutting down by now. That I think maybe would be shut down underneath a different platform. And so that those comparisons are tough. It's bad all around right now. I'm not trying to pretend like one is doing great and another's not, but I do think that there's a perception that PlayStation is like killing it because they're selling all these consoles and all this. And that Xbox is failing because they aren't selling consoles. That's literally the one metric that most people seem to be paying attention to and basing their opinion on these platforms on, when it's 2026. Like, we're kind of beyond that. You know, console sales aren't the only thing that matters. And I think that these moves, you know, by PlayStation, these aren't the moves that a company that's the health of it, the way it's being perceived, you know, the kind of company it is, the situation it's in, you know, these aren't the kind of moves that perception would lead you to believe, would lead you to think would happen. Right. So I think it's interesting. I think, and then, you know, Nintendo just doing their own thing on the side. You know, they might have to raise their console prices. We'll see. PlayStation or Xbox is supposedly still going to release new hardware next year. I think that's insane because it's going to be hilariously expensive or extremely underpowered. It's got to be one or the other. It's not going to be powerful and cheap. So we'll see what happens with that. It's just, things are probably going to get worse before they get better. I wish all these devs good luck finding new jobs. Maybe the studio does find a new home. There's not a lot of publishers buying right now. And so maybe they can go indie and get some funding, but there's not a lot of funding out there right now. And maybe, you know, make a game for somebody, you know, get a Game Pass deal or something. I don't know. There's probably not a lot of money happening there right now either. So we'll see. In another story here, we had Todd Howard was on Kinda Funny, did an interview with Greg Miller, covered a bunch of things. The first thing he covered was talking about Starfield. He kind of disputed this whole idea that some people had thrown out of a big update coming for Starfield that was going to be like Starfield 2.0 and kind of like the Cyberpunk or the No Man's Sky revival type of things. And I talked about how they do have a lot of content coming, some big changes to the game that he does think that, like, especially people who already like the game are going to be really happy with, or even like fence sitters, it may kind of push them over to the good side, right? People who do like the game. But definitely was like pretty big about, like, we aren't like reinventing the game. You know, the content that's coming out isn't going to turn it into a new game. And just as like an aside, before, that I really wish he would have just said it, but he should have just been like, it's a good game already. Obviously the online discourse about it is like weird, but like it's objectively good. Like, and I'm willing to argue that now. I was willing to argue it when it came out, and it's gotten better with updates and mods and things like that. But it is a good game. The thing it isn't is revolutionary. They didn't take the Bethesda formula and bring it up to, in a lot of ways you could say modern standards or to big evolutions of their formula. It's a Bethesda game in space. And they did improve a lot of things technically and mechanically, and even in gameplay wise, especially. But there's also, and he even acknowledged it during this interview of things feeling a little boring or empty and things like that. And it seems like those are things that are being addressed by the stuff they did do. But you could definitely tell he was trying to like pull back from that, like some of that things people were saying of like, hey, like this isn't like reinventing the game. This is still Starfield, but it's just going to have new stuff and be better, right? And what was interesting was Greg talked, he must have been one of the people who got to go to some event last year where they got to see the things that they're doing, where some of these 2.0 rumors came from. And he was kind of chiding them a little bit of being like, you guys brought us out, you showed us all this stuff. You told us we could say that we saw something, but you didn't let us say, like, we aren't allowed to talk about what we saw. And that led to a lot of these issues. And it does turn to one of those like communication things where, they may have fumbled a little bit by letting people talk about this at all, or even doing the event when they did it, rather than doing it like much closer to when this content actually released, which hopefully will be fairly soon. I love Starfield. I think it's a really good game. I think if you go into it being like allowing yourself to enjoy what it is instead of being mad that it isn't what you hoped it would be, I think you can have a ton of fun with Starfield. A lot of really good moments. I think the story is really cool. I like the characters in the game, or at least most of them. It is an evolution from Fallout 4. Like it is, if you look at almost every part of it, whether it's graphics or mechanics or gameplay or whatever, I do think it's better than Fallout 4 in every way, which is kind of what I think can realistically ask for from the next game from a studio. But it wasn't, they didn't turn it into having, the super smooth and really stylish conversation mechanics and all of that of like a Cyberpunk or, they didn't do that because that's not kind of who they are. And then what was interesting is during this conversation, Greg Miller brought up the Elder Scrolls 6 that was announced like 7 years ago at this point. And Todd was pretty hush hush talking about that and didn't have a lot of info to give. Basically said, hey, when we have stuff to tell you, we'll do it. He did harken back during this conversation about how Starfield, he didn't seem very happy with how that got announced because, like, if you remember Fallout 4, they announced it and it was coming out like 4 months later. Like, it was announced and coming out. And with Starfield, it had this huge lead up, and they went from, they got acquired by Xbox during that time. And then it turned into an Xbox exclusive, which brought a whole new level of pressure. And everyone thought it was going to be this big revolutionary, blow your mind game. And we waited for it forever. So people's minds went crazy. They started speculating and hoping and doing all this stuff. And then after multiple years of thinking about this game, it came out. And even though it was good, it wasn't necessarily what everyone wanted. Right. And that sucks. And you can tell, I suspect that when we finally see something about the Elder Scrolls 6, it's going to be like, hey, here's Elder Scrolls 6 and it's out in 4 months, because I suspect they don't want to do that again and go through all of that pain, even though they've kind of done that to themselves with that announcement like 7 years ago. I do think this is a little different because they haven't then been drip feeding us stuff since then. They just don't talk about it. Now, he did reveal one little bit of information that was kind of interesting, is that it will be using Creation Engine 3, where the previous games that they had used the Creation Engine versions for multiple games. This will be the first time, I believe, that I think Starfield is the only Creation Engine 2 game, and then this will be a big step, in theory, a big step up to the third one. He did kind of talk about how they would be sticking with kind of what they do, that people shouldn't expect any huge revolutionary changes. What I will say is that if you took the advances they made on Starfield and made that entire game on one planet or on one area of a map, and they condensed all of the improvements they made from Fallout 4 to Starfield and condensed them all to like a Fallout map sized game. Say Starfield took place on, the New Atlantis or whatever, and that's where the whole game took place, and they built out a, I don't know, 10 by 10 mile map, and that's where the whole game, and they condensed everything that they put into that game. It would be really impressive. And so that's what I assume Elder Scrolls 6 is going to be like, where you aren't going to be traveling the planets, there's not going to be empty space, there's not going to be moons with nothing happening on them. You're going to have a one map that you explore the whole map, and it's going to be much more condensed and much more of what you remember from Fallout, from Elder Scrolls, things like that. And I think that's when the improvements they made between Fallout 4 and Starfield, and then Starfield to Elder Scrolls 6, are really going to show, because it's going to be right in your face all the time of, these better looking textures, these hopefully better looking animations and conversations. That's something they do need to improve on for sure from Starfield. But all this stuff, like, it's going to be more apparent, the advances, I think. So he did also talk about how Fallout 76 is probably the game he's the most proud of, which is interesting because of how rough it released, and at least the reception of it, how rough it was, and how at this point it's like extremely popular. People love it. Like, if you don't know, like, Fallout 76 it's one of the only games I would equate to No Man's Sky that came out real rough and is beloved and extremely highly played, has a very big community, a very dedicated community. I honestly wouldn't even put Cyberpunk in that same thing, because it's not a multiplayer game the way No Man's Sky and 76 are, but also because while Cyberpunk, it did improve a lot, it still isn't the game they said it was going to be, in my opinion. That's just me, of course, where I think No Man's Sky did meet that and has gone far beyond it at this point. And then I think Fallout 76 has become the game that people kind of wanted it to be, that it initially definitely wasn't. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And then Greg poked Todd for Fallout 5 news, and he basically said nothing more. Talked about the TV show, how long it could go on, and how it was interesting. He said with the TV show, they do have endings for the current cast of characters, or the current version of the show. Like, they have an ending in mind already. So there's it's not like, oh, we might go 4 seasons or 10. We don't know. It sounds like they do have a very specific end state, which would make sense, because I can almost guarantee that end state is where Fallout 5 is going to pick up. This does seem to be a bridge game that they're going to be, or a bridge series that they're going to, they're taking things that we remember from Fallout 4 and New Vegas and Fallout 3, and they're moving the storyline along. And when the at least the current iteration of the Fallout show ends, that will plop us into Fallout 5. At least that's what it seems like to me. So it was a cool interview. I suggest going to watch it. A lot of the way it's been portrayed by Eurogamer and VGC and stuff, I think there's been some very convenient headlines and stuff being used, and I would suggest people actually watch it yourself, because love him or hate him, I like Todd a lot. I think he's one of the realest people, at least when he talks. I think he seems like he's super duper rich and probably out of touch for sure, but he can conversate like a real human being, and he seems like he genuinely really adores these games that they're working on, and still has that fire. So he's not exactly a spring chicken at this point, but he's probably still got some good years left in him. So hopefully he at least gets Fallout 5 out, is my hope. Battlefield 6 has a new season. It finally released this last week. It has a new map, a new mode and kind of gameplay state, some gameplay updates, and some new guns and vehicles and stuff like that. The new map is interesting. It takes place it's in Germany. It's a really, really big map. I don't know if it's the biggest one right now, but it's got to be up there. And it's getting pretty universal praise by people actually playing the game. I will try not to go into a Battlefield fan account and content creator rant right now, because it doesn't do anyone any good, I think. But they're just always going to be pessimistic and toxic, in my opinion. I think that's a lost cause at this point. But people actually playing the game seem to really enjoy the new map. My hot take is I hate it. I don't like the new map at all. it's like too big with not enough players. My thing with Battlefield is that in 2042, this is one of the things I thought it actually did well, because it had so many players on these big maps that you would establish like a front line. So, it was, kind of based on what points were taken in conquests and stuff. But you could always kind of tell by looking at the map, like, here's a rough front line. So if you want to get into the action, there's where you go. If you want to try to get behind people and maybe do some covert stuff, this is what you need to get around. And my issue is with this 64 player map being so huge, it's just a bunch of random people running around everywhere. There's not enough people to set like a front line. And so to me, at least, maybe I'm just bad, I don't know, I don't like it, because at any given moment you can get shot from any angle, where I feel like good Battlefield maps kind of establish that front line. And while maybe you will get picked off from behind or someone will flank you or whatever, you can still kind of like, okay, I'm here and I'm pretty sure the enemy is like this way. And you can kind of work from there, with obviously the exceptional situation happening here and there. And I just don't think this map has that. So it's beautiful. It looks really good. Lots of great destruction. I hope we see more of this kind of stuff. But I hope they don't feel like they can only make these kind of maps now, because that's what the vocal minority is asking for. The loudest people are, we must have big maps and blah, blah, blah. Sure, let's give us some big maps, remake some old ones, give us some new ones, but let's not, only do that, because I think some of the smaller, medium-sized maps are really good too. And in some ways I prefer them, especially with the gameplay of Battlefield 6. There's a new mode. It's like a gas mask thing where it's very limited. It's only there if you want it to be. You have to choose to go into this, but there's this effect where on the capture points, there'll be like these gas clouds and you have to put on a mask that only lasts so long. And if it runs out, or if you don't use it, you can get like hallucinations of like, you'll think there's a player in front of you and you'll shoot at them and it's just a ghost. And obviously, other people will see that and you'll get hit and all that. It's neat. I've played a couple of rounds of it. Not my preferred thing, but I'm glad it's there. It's kind of like the ice event from the last season, where it was okay, but I kind of thought I don't know, it got old pretty quick for me. I just played it as much as I had to get my rewards, and then I moved on. But it's cool. I don't hate it. There's a bunch of gameplay updates. They've balanced a bunch of guns and handling of guns and weapons and all that. Feels really good. The movement feels different. It's not slower, but feels more like grounded. And I think it seems like, and this is just my feel of the game, I feel like I've died way, way, way less around corners, where I'm getting shot at. I go around a corner, and then because of netcode or, whatever is going on with their systems, tick rates or whatever, I would die around the corner, even though I knew I got away. I've noticed way less of that. And I've noticed a lot more responsiveness when actually shooting. So maybe it's in my head, maybe it's a placebo effect, but it seems like it's worked pretty well. The new weapons and vehicles, I haven't gotten to play any of the new weapons yet. I haven't unlocked them. But the little bird, which is the little helicopter, I haven't got to mess with either, actually using some terrible at helicopters, but they are a menace. The people who are good at helicopters seem to be enjoying them very much. I think eventually people are going to figure out that you can take those down with guns. You don't have to use rockets. If you have a couple LMGs lighting it up, you'll take it down eventually fairly quickly, especially with the right ammo types, I think. But until that happens, and they'll have to do some balancing and stuff probably, it seems like it's a good vehicle that people are enjoying. And I've seen there's a new assault rifle that people are like out of their minds about. Apparently it's really, really, really good, because everyone's grinding to get it, and I assume everyone's going to be using it. That's cool, especially if it stops everyone from using freaking P90s with scopes. I hate every time I die from like 200 meters away and I see the pop-up and it's a freaking P90 with a scope. Like they do need to figure out why like assault rifles are like useless in like medium and long range, but SMGs are like sniper rifles. I do hope they figure some of that stuff out. But overall, I'm really satisfied with the season so far. I think it's good, and I think the plans they have for more maps and more modes and more events and cosmetics and unlocks and all that for the next 2 months look pretty good. I would always take more, but I do think we've hit kind of a weird moment with like content creators and stuff being real big babies about nothing ever being enough. And my honest take on it, and I won't go too deep into it, is that they could release 5 new maps every other month, and they could be the best maps in the world and all these new guns and vehicles and all that. And these people would still find a way to complain because just everyone's monetized now. And the best way to get clicks, to make money, is to be negative and pessimistic and toxic. And while there are for sure real complaints to have, I don't want to discount that at all. It feels pretty forced a lot of the time. And I hate that, if I have to be totally honest. So Battlefield 6 Season 2, pretty good. Could be better. Hopefully they'll get their things going. When it comes to their processes and stuff. I suspect losing the head of their company probably didn't help here in the last couple months. Hopefully they get all that figured out and can maybe churn out a little more content. But I also think people should be happier with it than they are, or at least the loud minority of folks should be happier. I suspect most of the people who actually play the game are doing pretty good. Well, we're talking about Highguard again, and we found out that Wildlight, their studio that made it, or is still technically working on it, I guess, was pretty heavily funded by Tencent in some early rounds of fundraising. This was a funny story because it really showed you who's been paying attention to how things are working, and how kind of knowledgeable individuals are on this stuff. Because if you have been paying attention, you know that Tencent has like their fingers in every single publisher, every single studio, and a bunch of indies. They are literally everywhere. Now, some of them in very, very small ways, others in much larger ways. But Tencent is basically everywhere at this point. They are somewhat invested with basically everybody. And so it was so funny seeing people get weird about this, being like, oh, how can they be an indie if Tencent is funding them? It's like, you guys think that Larian is an indie. They got Tencent funding, and they have like multiple studios around the world. Like, they are a legit AAA studio. They just happen to be independent, right? And that conversation was so funny. And in my favorite, there was a conspiracy people were throwing out of, oh, Jeff Keighley has someone from Tencent on the Game Awards board. Therefore, they convinced him to make Highguard the final game shown at the Game Awards. It's like, guys, Tencent, literally, they're involved with everybody. If they were using their weight to make something like that happen, they probably would have done it with a different game. Let's just be honest, right? It probably wasn't going to be Highguard. I think Jeff is a weird guy who has kind of questionable gaming taste, and I think he played Highguard, and I suspect he's not much of a multiplayer gamer. And we're like, oh, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen. I'm gonna put you guys on my show, and they were probably like, oh, okay, I guess. Probably not, in hindsight, probably not the best decision. Even though I don't think the ending would have been any different. I don't think that conspiracy. I don't like Jeff. I think he's a detriment to the games industry personally. That's a different conversation to have, I guess. But So, and if anything, it explains the short leash to me of why Highguard came out and like 2 weeks later they laid everyone off, and it's likely going to shut down sooner than later because Tencent, NetEase, a lot of these Chinese companies that invested a ton of money into especially the Western game industry in 2020-ish. They're pulling that money out. In 2020, you saw all these studios pop up or that window. There's like 30 of them. Here's a new AAA indie studio led by this guy you heard of at EA or at BioWare or at Activision or whatever, and they're making this thing. And there were dozens of these studios that popped up, and they were all mostly funded by NetEase and Tencent and so on. And like none of them still exist. A good example was Humanoid from Casey Hudson, the former BioWare guy, who he was going to make it, and they were a studio for like 5 years, and then they shuttered a year or two ago, and they never even announced the game. When you see what's happening with Highguard, to me, seeing that they were partially funded by Tencent just makes sense. Like, oh, sure, they're pulling their money back. They probably had a short leash. They either needed to be hot when the game came out, or the game's basically done, which is seemingly what's happening. But other people, it turned into this like, they aren't even an indie studio. It's like, y'all, like Larian, who you all think is an indie studio, has multiple studios and hundreds of employees around the world. Like, chill out. So I'm not here to defend Wildlight or Tencent or Highguard. I think the game is mediocre. I think the studio was insane trying to make this game, and Tencent, just kind of, they're just this giant thing that exists, I guess. But yeah, a lot of this conversation was pretty dumb, and it doesn't bother me when regular people like me, people just on social media and stuff, have these like stupid takes about that stuff. It was really frustrating to see a lot of influencers with like tens of hundreds of thousands of followers, or content creators with hundreds of thousands of subscribers, or whatever. And like I always ream on, journalists and gaming commenters, if that's what you want to call them, like really playing into this, and like even like kind of like playing into some of these conspiracies and stuff. It's like, y'all, like you guys know better. Like, you guys know how this stuff works. There's no way this is a surprise to any of those people. But the almighty clicks, man, you got to do what you got to do, I guess. And we definitely saw that with this. So, I think it only explains the situation more. I don't think it's really more or less than that. The marathon marketing push is in full force. There was this one situation I had to kind of comment on. Look, I genuinely, at this point, I hope marathon ends up being really successful, and then I have to like come back in 6 months to be like, okay guys, I was wrong. Marathon's super good. I can't stop playing it. It has 250,000 concurrent. It's the best game ever made. But I do have to point out that there was a situation that happened in this last week where Marathon put out this 4-minute play segment of gameplay, obviously highly edited, and definitely the best moments from recent playtests they've done with like streamers and stuff. The clip's fine. Show off your gameplay, show off the things that you've improved and all that. I think that's cool. It did look great. I think it's kind of an ugly game. I know everyone loves the like weird style of it. I think it's like too much. I think it's like, no, that's just a personal opinion, but that's fine. But what was so funny is that this 4-minute clip got posted on social media and all by tons of people, but it especially got done with some really curiously similar, like posts, the wording of them, by a bunch of people who are clearly going to have like streaming ads and stuff like that to play this game when it comes out. And it was so funny. Like you would see like just the glazing. I think I made a joke, or I've done it before, of like enough glaze to open a donut shop, right? Like be excited about the game. That's cool. Hype it up, say the footage looks great, because I'm sure a lot of people thought it did. But it was just so funny that you could see these. I think the ones that really annoyed me weren't just people being like, oh, wow, this looks really cool, I'm excited to play it. But the ones being like, oh, haters see this and think it sucks. It's like, man, like you can't be more transparent than that, unless you just said, oh man, Bungie's gonna give me a bunch of money to support this game, which is fine. I'm cool with ads. I'm cool with advertisements and sponsorships and all that. It's all good. But like, I'm curious, like Shroud, he's like hyping it up real big. It's like, you would think that after stealing all that money from Mixer, that he wouldn't even like show his face anymore, but he's still out there doing his thing, and definitely taking big giant fat ad deals and streaming deals. It's just, these guys are all gonna bounce as soon as those ads end, even if it's a decent game. But because a lot of them did it with Arc Raiders, held on to people, a lot of these guys, longer than you would think. But they're all burned out at this point, because that game, it wasn't meant to be what they made it into. Like what the gamers, the way that it was being played, especially by these high profile people, is obviously not what they intended for Arc Raiders to be, this like hyper sweaty PvP game. I will say Marathon does seem to be more in that vein, so it may make sense if it ends up appealing to those people more, because it does seem to be more of that, like basically a death match with extraction mechanics and some PvE mixed in there. So yeah, it was just, for me, it was just really funny to see a really obvious ad campaign like spinning up with all of these people who had like 50 to 100,000 followers, who stream on Twitch every day or make tons of YouTube content, being like, oh, I don't know why the haters are hating on this game, or man, the haters say this game is ugly. Just look at it. It's just like, I thought it was kind of funny, so I had to talk about it. You feel free to judge me in the comments. Xbox is removing a key feature that everyone loved, and it truly is a sign of the end for my favorite console brand. They're removing social clubs. I forgot they still existed. If I have to be told, I knew they were a thing. I want to say back to, was it back to 360? I think maybe they started in Xbox One days. Is a cool idea, right? And I think in the days before Discord and before, the social media got really put in with games and even like Reddit and things like that, I think they made sense. They fulfilled that way of finding other people who play the game, maybe even matchmaking, like finding people to play with in these things. But it ended up not being necessary. There's, and even heck now, the Discord integration with Xbox is so good that, it's even less necessary because of that. It was really funny seeing this portrayed by some, of course the clickbait websites were like, Xbox removing crucial feature from their OS or whatever. And then it would be like, oh yeah, this thing that like 50 people still use. I'm sure there's a few communities that are actually pretty active. But the vast majority, you could have an Xbox for the last 10 years and not even know that social clubs were really a thing. Maybe you saw the button, but you just never clicked on it, or it just passed you by entirely. But yeah, the portrayal of this was kind of funny. But I guess any time a feature is being lost, it's bad, I guess. But with this one, I don't think it's really going to affect things much. Nintendo will get your money and you will give it to them now. This comes off of them announcing or just throwing it onto their store that you can get Pokemon Fire Red or Leaf Green, which I believe are advanced games, on the Switch now. They're $20. They don't have localization, so you have to buy, if you speak English, you have to buy the English one. If you speak another language, you have to buy that one. And it is just so funny to me that in 2026 that they couldn't, because I think someone even said that on the original games on Game Boy Advance, you can pick the language. So like literally they went out of their way. Like maybe it was a licensing thing, maybe it's a ratings thing. I do know that the game has gambling in it, and that means in some regions it has to be rated differently. And so maybe that's why they're split up, because depending on what region that language would be primary in, maybe, I don't know, but I just thought it was funny. And for $20, like, yeah, it's $20. I do remember even from my GameStop days, like 20 years ago, and apparently it's still true. Some of those like OG Pokemon games would be like $100. And it looks like, from what I saw in the conversation about this, is that it's even worse now. It's even more expensive because it's hard to find those cartridges anymore. And so, I just thought this was kind of funny. It was very Nintendo, very demure. They do their thing, man, and they make so much money. Their profit margin is like double of PlayStation or Xbox, and this is why, because they can do this and no one's really going to raise a stink. Millions of people are probably going to buy this, and instead of just getting it on an emulator. And all good, cool. If that's what makes you happy, you pay your 20, you get that cool old classic game. It really is, like, because I believe Leaf Green and Fire Red are like remasters of the original, like the blue, red, and yellow Pokemon, like the OG ones. I want to say that's what they are, because I may or may not have played one of them in the last couple of years and had a blast with it. It's so fun, because it has all the newer like mechanics and stuff, newer Game Boy Advance, but it's pretty cool. And if that's your thing, then wet your whistle. And then finally, here with the last story, we have the Ubisoft CEO Yves Guillemot has done an interview with Variety. The big takeaways from it are that they have 2 Far Cry games in development, which is interesting. Several Assassin's Creed games are in development. I believe we heard about a multiplayer one being canceled that we had heard about, but we still have like the Hexa, and which I think is supposed to be like a early Colonies, like a Colonies era game, but not like Assassin's Creed 3, I guess. I don't really know. We'll have to wait and see what comes of that. There's a Rayman remaster that's coming, and that's not the only game, so they kind of tease that there's more Rayman coming. Like, cool, man. I can't say I've ever played a Rayman game. He did talk about how the creative houses where they've broken up their studios into these groups are going to be treated basically as individual companies, and for better or worse. So basically they have like an A tier, which is their deal with Tencent, the B tier, which is like, I want to say like Ghost Recon, The Division, a few other pretty good brands. They're probably good. Then there was like a C and a D tier. That D tier has got to be sweating because they're gone. Like, it's just, unfortunately, I suspect that that's going to be the long term, is that C and D tier, the studios in those two creative houses, as they're calling it, it's probably bad news bears. Maybe they'll maybe a few of them will go away and they'll combine those into a more solid C tier. We'll have to wait and see. I don't know. And then he said they have several new IPs in development. You know, does that include Beyond Good and Evil 2, which has been in development literally for like 15 years? We'll have to wait and see. I don't hate Ubisoft the way other people do. I kind of do just like The Division now, even though I haven't played it in like 2 years, at least not consistently. But I'm super excited for that next game. I guess I'm curious about Ghost Recon. I guess I'm curious about Far Cry. Definitely, like, more than curious about Assassin's Creed. I love Shadows. I thought that was a blast after I didn't really love Mirage, but I did like, you know, Odyssey and Origins and stuff like that. Didn't like Valhalla at all. We'll have to wait and see. Ubisoft is very much in put up or shut up territory for me. I need to see them put things out. So hopefully they do. And with some content updates, I don't have a ton. I'm going to be honest. Real busy. Things have been kind of crazy around here. I want to stream. I just haven't had time, or I sit and I have a couple hours to myself and okay, I'm going to do it. And then I look at that live button, and then I look at, you know, the dishes I could be doing, or I could just be playing some games on my own time and relaxing for an hour or two. And that tends to win. So I've also been really busy on the weekends this whole month. I've had something big going on every single week, and that continues this weekend and next weekend. And then maybe it loosens up a little bit. We'll have to wait and see. So I have a Mass Effect playthrough ready to go. We're ready to jump in. I'm happy to jump on and play some of that and talk about that and everything else. So preparing for that, make sure to go to Twitch, search for Bon Diesel, and follow me there. If you have a Prime sub from Amazon, maybe give it to me. No harm, no foul. Don't let it go to waste. I'll happily take it. It helps support everything I'm doing here. But that's up to you. So other than that, I put out a Mass Effect Hypecast fairly recently. Obviously, we have the Gamecast continuing here. I'm always wanting to do some interviews, bring some people back on, like Yannick from The Division, or maybe try to get like a BioWare dev on at some point or something like that. I can't imagine basically any of those people have any desire to do interviews right now, though. So that's, you know, kind of on hold until it makes more sense. And then I don't know, that's kind of it for the content updates. And that is where we wrap things up. If you have any questions or feedback, hit me up on social media at Bon Diesel or at the Baunfire. Join my Discord via the Linktree link in the episode description, or comment on Spotify or YouTube. I read every single one. I reply on most of them, unless you're a big old poopy head, and then I hide you or delete you or whatever seems right. That is all I have for this episode of the Baunfire Gamescast. So until next time.